we'll be celebrating 100 years of statehood in 2022. But over the first 100 years, every generation or so, we lost a large number of our people in the 1920s, the 1950s, the 1980s, and again in the last 5 or 6 years through the recession. So today, are you ready for this? We've a population in Ireland of 4.5 million in the south and 6 million on the island as a whole. The number of people of Irish identity, heritage and descent around the world is 70 million. So we've 4.5 million in Ireland, 70 million around the world, which is a stunning figure. We estimate that there are about 3 million Irish citizens around the world, very like yourselves, but we're a population of 4.5 million, and you're 45 million. So that maybe gives you some idea. And there's one other statistic I want to give you. In 1855, that's about 10 years after the famine, the census in Manhattan showed that the population of New York that night, the night of the census in 1855, was 25% of the population of Manhattan was Irish born. So which is an extraordinary movement of people. So immigration has been part of who we are and what we are. And it's been a very, very big issue. And I suppose I just wanted to tell you how we've handled it as a state. The actuality of it is that, and I have to say this straight up, immigration is a challenging issue for any country. It's a controversial issue and it's a complex issue. I think that's the first thing we have to say about it. I think I use the phrase, before good action comes good understanding. So I think we need to understand what we're dealing with here. I think what Kenya is doing is really interesting and significant. I think you're doing something very important. But I do say, and I'm sure you know this anyway, it is a complex, challenging space. And I see that your strategy, which I've been studying carefully, recognizes that, and I think that's very, very good. I wanted to talk just a little bit about, just very briefly in terms of what Ireland has done as a state. So in fact, the reality is that for the first 70 or 80 years of statehood, we actually did the Irish government, partly because it was almost too challenging, it was too painful, it was too difficult. Of course, we had remittances like you have from our people. The generosity of our diaspora has been a huge part of it. But it really was only in about 10, 12 years ago, that we began to put in place a strategy like you're doing now. And we created the Irish Abroad Unit in the Foreign Ministry, and we began then. And the first thing that unit did was actually create a program called the Immigrant Support Program, supporting Irish communities around the world. And that's been very successful. And then 5 or 6 years later, in 2009, we set up a new body called the Global Irish Economic Forum. So this was the first attempt to begin a kind of a strategic engagement with our diaspora. And that's been an important piece as well. And last year, for the first time ever, we created a minister for the diaspora. That's so the first time ever we had that, Minister Jimmy Deanahan, who's a great advocate of diaspora. But just to show you that how challenging it is, we still haven't been able to tackle the whole issue of voting rights for immigrants. So there are lots of things to do. But what we have been doing now much more is beginning to engage with our diaspora in economic terms, and I know that's a piece of what today is about. So broadly speaking, so I think we're on an exciting journey in Ireland as well, very like what you're doing here, and I think that's very interesting. Could I just briefly, though, before I talk about Kenya in the future, I think under the heading of understanding what we're dealing with, I want to talk for a few minutes about the nature of the immigrant. I think that because I have a huge respect for the immigrant. Now, the statistic from the world is that 3% of the world is immigrant. 3% of the world live in a country other than which they were born. But the other side of that is that 97% of people aren't immigrants. 97% of people live in the country in which they were born. So being an immigrant is a very minority piece. So why is there so much about the immigrant? Because in fact, I believe that immigrants are an incredibly powerful group of people in the world. And why is that? Because I think you're leaders. I think you are risk takers. I think you're people who look to the future. I think you're people who And I think that's actually a big piece of, and 3 years ago, The Economist did a major study on immigrants. The front page was "The Magic of Diasporas: How Migrant Networks Are Reshaping the World." And it's from November 2012. So that had some very, very interesting kind of statistics about the power of immigrants. So immigrants are shaping the future, shaping the world. You're really, really powerful. However, I think that the relationship between immigrants and the home place is actually quite complex. So I'm no longer a public servant, so I can sort of say a couple of things maybe, and I think there's some of this in your strategy, but the challenge is that the immigrant left. The immigrant left the home place, and so the question is, what does that mean? And I think that for a lot of immigrants, therefore, if you're living in a world other than which you were born, there's a question about the identity. Who am I? Who am I? If I'm a Kenyan living in Washington or in London, or who am I? Am I a Kenyan still? Am I American now? And I think what I've learned from dealing with Irish immigrants is that actually you become probably two people. The president that I worked for when I was chief of staff is President McAleese. She used to say that the immigrant has two hearts. One heart for, in our case, Ireland, and one heart for the new country that has taken them in and where they now have made their home and probably where their children are growing up. But so that's a challenge. And then I think a key piece for me, my learning, is that in the relationship with the diaspora, a key foundation stone is the attitude of what I call the home place. What is the attitude of the home place to the diaspora? And the reason for that is very simple, because if the home place takes the relationship seriously, that's one. But if it doesn't, then in my view, it's going to be very difficult for any significant things to happen. So I think, so in my view, the first move rests with the home place to say, you are part of us, we are still one family, and we are going to be together. A colleague of mine in the foreign ministry came up with a good analogy of it. He said that, it's like the difference between a wedding and a marriage. So putting the diaspora relationship in your constitution and coming up with a diaspora strategy and coming up with a communication strategy, that's very important. We'll call that the wedding. But then, of course, there's the marriage and the day in, day out, and the living out of that relationship till death do us part. That's a much harder piece, and that's the journey that you're setting out on now. And so perhaps I could see it that actually maybe the new relationship between the home place and those who left is a compact, and goes something like this, which is that the home place is the custodian of the heritage and the identity of those who have left. So we in the home place say, we will be the custodians of your identity, your heritage, for you and your children, if that's valuable to you. And then the diaspora become our partners and pathfinders, our supporters in a complex global world. And that's the compact, because I think it has to be based on mutuality. If it's only about what can you do for us, I think like any human relationship, it will fail. And so I just wanted to talk a bit about Kenya now, what I've seen of what you're doing, what your strategy. I think it's terrific. I think you've made a great start. Your strategy is very wise. It's smart. It's honest, which I thought was terrific. It talks about the mistrust between, Kenya and historically and the diaspora. That's very honest, because that's actually, that gives me a sense that there's a very good chance that this will be a good marriage, not just a good wedding. And also I think you're focusing on the needs of the diaspora, which is very, very good. I like what you're doing around structures is very good, your national diaspora, and with Washington here, I think you're in very, very good hands. So and of course I'm hugely impressed with the generosity of your diaspora as well, that 3% of GDP is in remittances. That's an enormous contribution by your people, and showing their deep connection to the home place. So My advice would be, and I want to talk a bit obviously on the economic side, my advice would be, and I'm not trying to come in here, I'm learning as well, I've learned already, my job is here, is also to be learning, and I know that I'm speaking for the Ambassador. Ireland wants to be with you at every stage of this journey. We would love to partner with you in this journey going forward, and I know Ambassador O'Neill and Jane Ann are very committed to that. But here are a few suggestions as a friend, drawing on our experience in Ireland over the last 10 years in particular. I would say it is really important that you resource and capacitate what you're going to do now in terms of the diaspora relationship. In other words, don't have a great wedding and then not really think about how you're going to do the marriage. You have to, and so that's the first piece. I think that with the ambassadors here, I think it's very clear that you are well served, and also the work of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I think you're very well served in terms of what you're trying to do internationally out there with the diaspora, and I see it from your communication strategy as well. You have very good strategies for out there, but I think you must pay great attention to what you do here at home in Kenya in terms of promoting diaspora engagement. So I think your domestic stakeholders are really, really important, and how you do that is because if in fact, if you like, the gospel of diaspora engagement and the importance of it isn't spread throughout the domestic departments and the agencies and around society in Kenya, then it's going to be very difficult for it to take deep root. I like what you're doing about the local authorities, the 47 counties and the governors, and that's a hugely important piece of the equation, I think, as well. And I would strongly recommend, because my good friend Kingsley here, you'll be hearing from later, has a very good insight that diaspora isn't just about country, it's about place. So I think the place where your diaspora are from in Kenya is a really important piece. So the role of the counties is very important. And then I think when you're engaging with diaspora and that you want them doing more and more involved, make it easy for them to be involved. Make it easy for them to do that. We had a Global Irish Economic Forum gathering in Dublin a few weeks ago, and one person stood up, he's living in Asia and he's in the pharmaceutical world, and he said, look, I'm in the pharma business, happily and luckily for me I'm doing well, but pharma, that's my interest. I want to be engaged with Ireland, but I want to be engaged in my own way. I want to be engaged around the pharma sector. And he said, so I'm prepared to contribute and to do what I can, but he said, I don't want to be making 10 phone calls to figure out who I need to be talking to. So make it easy for people if they do want to be involved. And then the other lesson that I've learned myself over the last 10 years is the importance of culture in this relationship. Now I thought, congratulations to your representatives of Kenyan culture we had this morning. It was very interesting. But actually, in terms of the lives of the home place Kenya and the diaspora, in fact, the reality is the lives are very different. The moment you leave, you're in a different world. And the moment you decide to stay, you're in a different world. So the two worlds are very, very different. But I think one of the absolutely key bonds is culture. So I would think that I would recommend Washington that you place a big emphasis on culture as a kind of a connecting piece. And in economic terms, because I am saying to you, I think you're onto something very powerful. I think your diaspora, if it's based on a mutual relationship of respect, which you're clearly trying to do, then I think your diaspora can play an enormous role. And here are some stories just very quickly out of Ireland where our diaspora played a pivotal role. So you're all familiar with the Ford motor, the Ford car. Well, Henry Ford, his grandfather was from Ireland, so the founder, and he was persuaded in something like in the 1920s, I think. He actually before that, he created the first Ford motor plant outside of Ireland, was outside of the United States, was founded in Cork in Ireland. And there's a great story about how he came over, and he was met by, when he arrived in Cork, of course, Cork is a city in the south of Ireland, he got a great reception, but he was visited early by some nuns, and who are trying to develop a local charity, and they got to see him, and he understood that he was supposed to make a contribution of something like £3,000 or something at the time. But when the nuns went out to the media, they turned the 3,000 into 300,000. So Henry Ford went and did a little public interview, and he said, "I met the nuns and they were marvelous. I met them and they took me in." Anyway, so that was Henry Ford, but that was really, really important, what he did in terms of the Ford Motor Company. And then Irish America in the current wave of foreign investment in Ireland. Of course, I'm sure you know already that the critical piece of the Irish economy is our foreign direct investment from companies into Ireland, and Ireland is a major location for American investment in Ireland. And a big part of that has been driven by Irish American leaders in corporate America. People like Don Keogh, who was the president and CEO of Coca-Cola. And he was a good friend of mine in New York, and he told me, I met him one day, and he told me, I said to him, "Don, I've been looking at Irish America, and I can see that, in the 1980s, it took until the 1980s for you to become leaders in corporate America." And he said, "Yes, that's right." And he said, a few of us got together after we became CEOs, and we said, "Let's go back and take a look at the home place, the old country. And if we find something there, we'll work with it. And if we don't, we'll play golf." So they came, and he said we met a man called Kieran McGowan, who was at the time the chief executive of the IDA, which is your kind of Ken Invest, and the rest is history, because Kieran McGowan was a wise man who understood the power of what was being offered to him. And from that, 30 years ago, has come investments like Coca-Cola, Intel, who now employs 6,000 people in Ireland. Microsoft came in. Don Keogh brought Bill Gates to Ireland for the first time. And also we had a company like Merrill Lynch. And there's a great story of Dan Tully of Merrill Lynch, who was apparently making a decision as to whether Merrill Lynch would open in Geneva or in Dublin. And there was a careful study, and as it was a 50-50 call as between Geneva and Dublin. And Dan Tully, because he's Irish American, had to recuse himself from the final decision. But he told his colleagues on the board, and after all, he was the president and CEO, and he said, "It's up to you now, colleagues, what you decide. But remember, there are no Tullys in the phone book in Geneva." Anyway, so Merrill Lynch opening in Dublin, and just two sort of stories that I just wanted to tell you about quickly about what we've done with Diaspora in Ireland in the economic area, which have come from the engagement with Diaspora. One is called The Gathering, a project which we did in 2013, and Washington a few minutes ago talked about 1 million visitors becoming 3 million. Well, in 2013, we kind of had a project like that. We called it The Gathering. So the Irish government declared 2013 as the year that the diaspora would gather in Ireland. Now, we didn't really expect that all 70 million of them would come at the one time, Washington, because we didn't think we'd have enough tea and coffee to greet them all. But actually, it was a tremendous... So at the start, when it was announced in 2011, everybody was saying, "What is this? What does the gathering mean?" So what we did was we worked with the local authorities. We had town hall meetings around the country explaining to people how it would work, and I would advise you that your local authorities were... So we had 70 town hall meetings around the country. 10,000 people came to those, and at the end of each of those town hall meetings, people knew what they had to do. So in the end, the year was a tremendous success. We had 5,000 gatherings organized by families, communities, businesses. Everybody just bought into the idea that this was the thing to do. And it became something very powerful, because once you decided you were going to host a gathering, what was it going to be? My family from Limerick in the south, we had a gathering, and we had about 140 people at it. Now, a lot of those were from around Ireland, but many came from the United States. And I had a cousin from San Francisco, and whom I'd never met before. His grandfather and my grandfather were brothers, and he was about my age. And he said to me, "Well, Tim, it's very simple." He said, "Coming to Ireland was always on my bucket list, but I never quite got round to it. Then you guys invited me, And I said, I'm coming, and here I am. So I think the power of the invitation by the home place was critical. And that's what was at the heart of the gathering. It wasn't a question, well, you know where Kenya is, you can come if you want to. It was, no, we are turning to you, we are inviting you, we are going to host you, and then we're going to tell you the story. Now, obviously, for Kenyan born, you don't have to tell the story of where, but for, in our case, a lot of the people, our diaspora who came, were not necessarily first generation. So we had, families had to tell the story, and then the diasporans told the story of their journeys. So it was very, very powerful. And so so I would recommend that to you as a thought that you might look at, something organized. And the last thing I would say about the gathering, it was a great partnership between central government, which created the platform, but then also local government and the people. You know, create the platform enabling people to come together in that way. And the other project I want to tell you about is called Connect Ireland. Now, Connect Ireland is an economic project. It's the brainchild of a, I have to do full disclosure here, I now work with him, I advise him, a young entrepreneur called Terry Clune, who came to the Taoiseach, came to the Prime Minister 4 years ago with a very simple idea. And Ireland was in the middle of a very tough recession. He said, why don't we mobilize our diaspora to become connectors to companies looking for a European base? And we will work with them then to make that happen. It's as simple as that. The Prime Minister, I was at the meeting, he said, stop, I've heard enough. This is the kind of thinking I want driving Ireland's recovery. Who do I need to call to make this happen? I'm the Prime Minister. And out of that project came a project called, in fact, the government programme, which is implemented by the IDA, Ken Invest in your case, is called Succeed in Ireland. And it's implemented by Connect Ireland, which is a private company. So from a standing start 3.5 years ago, today Connect Ireland has 61 companies, have now committed to locating in Ireland. 1,800 jobs have been approved through the project. We are in 14 different counties around Ireland. Because here's the thing, the connectors have not just been able to bring the companies into Ireland, but they've been able to bring them to their home districts, which is very, very powerful. We have 60,000 connectors. If you look at KenyaMOJA.com, you will see there are 60,000 connectors are connected, have registered to be connectors. So 60,000 members of the diaspora who are out there wanting to support Ireland. So it's a highly successful project. I offer it to you as an example, a very simple example, but I suppose the key is that what we're doing is creating a means by which people can get involved. So that'd be my message to you. Make it easy for people to do it. So for Connect Ireland to work, all you have to know is, or know somebody, a cousin of yours who might know somebody, and they make the first connection. That's all they have to do. And it's say you're a Kenyan and you're living in Los Angeles and you hear your friend talking about his software company, he's got 400 people and he's looking for a base, and so he's looking for a base in Africa. Well, have you not thought about Kenya? And I have some people that can help you, and you just make the connection. And after, so Connect Ireland steps in and does all the rest of it then, you know. And so I would say to you that's an interesting idea. And the other piece I would say to you is that in our case, what's been very important is Irish people in leadership in our multinationals. So this combination between, in your case, the Kenyans and the multinationals, that can be something very powerful, because in Ireland we find that they wear two hats. They wear their multinational hat. So if you're a senior executive in IBM or Google or whatever, you wear your corporate hat, but you also wear your Ireland hat. And I think that's a very important piece. So I would, in conclusion, I would say that I'd be very excited about the future and the journey that you're on here in Kenya with this. I would really, really encourage you in that. And I would say to the ambassadors who are here, I think you've a very powerful, new, exciting message to bring. You're doing something very wise and smart for your country. I also think that it's a very timely project as you begin your 52 years of state this month. So you're in the second 50 years of statehood. And I think this is a great project, you know, for as you dream about Kenya at 100, if you in 50 years' time have achieved the unification almost of the Kenyan nation in the world, you know, how powerful is that? Obviously you have a very interesting global leader in your by the name of, what's his name again? Oh, sorry, Barack Obama, yes. A really powerful figure. In Ireland, we have the very same, a man called John F. Kennedy. And John F. Kennedy, just very briefly, in 1960, John F. Kennedy became president of America. And I was 8 years old at the time, so you can do the maths now. I'm now 38. So I was an 8-year-old in a small elementary school down in the middle of the country. And I can remember that was my first piece of political consciousness, because the headmaster in our school drew a map of America on the blackboard, and he drew all the states. And each morning, because this was before the internet and computers and everything. So the American election, if you check back, took 2 or 3 days for the counting and all of that. So each morning for those days, I couldn't wait to get into school to find out what states had gone overnight to Nixon and what had gone to Kennedy. And then when Kennedy won, it was incredible. And then 3 years later, 1963, we had our July 2015 moment. John F. Kennedy came to Ireland for 4 days. And it was unbelievable what that did for us. Here we were, 40-something years into statehood, frankly not going very well, not going great, be honest. It was very challenging, it was very difficult. A lot of our people had left in the 20s, a lot more had left in the 50s. And by 1963, there was a real question mark about what about this project? And then in our midst came one of our own, like Hollywood superstar. He looked so great, and he mesmerized us for 4 days. But you know what? We also had an impact on him. And 50 years later, 2 years ago, we had the gathering of the Kennedys down in New Ross, which is the place where he was from. And his nephew, Douglas Kennedy, Robert Kennedy's son, said 2 very interesting things about that visit by Kennedy. He said that in those 4 days in 1963 were the happiest 4 days in the life of JFK. Well, that was a bit of a big thing to say, but anyway, we were pretty chuffed with that. But then he said something very profound. This is Douglas Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's nephew. He said, in those 4 days, JFK came to himself. He came to himself. And that's a really powerful insight into something clicked for JFK, probably that he didn't even know that he was missing, to understanding himself. Sadly, he only lived a further 5 months. As we know, he was assassinated in November. But in those 5 months, actually, it changed the way he carried his presidency. And you can study that. So that's a really important insight there about how he came to himself. And there's a phrase I heard from a sociologist about immigration in Ireland. He said, immigration is a mirror in which the Irish nation can always see its true face. Immigration is a mirror in which the Irish nation can always see its true face. I'm not sure, you have to decide, is that true for Kenya or not? But if it is, immigration is a mirror in which the Kenyan nation can always see its true face. I take it to mean that we are 2 sides of the same coin, and we can only define ourselves fully by reference to the other. If that's true, how powerful that is. So I'm saying to you, you are beginning the journey of coming to yourselves now, and it's a great project for the next 50 years, so that when Kenya is at 100, and you might say, isn't that a long sort of period of time? Well, that's the kind of journey we're on. I heard a good insight recently from an American friend of mine. He said, our primary responsibility as human beings is to be good ancestors. Our primary responsibility as human beings is to be good ancestors. Well, I think what you're doing here in Kenya is you're on your way to being good ancestors, which you already are, but I think it's really important. And I repeat what I said at the beginning, Ireland will be with you all of the way in this journey. You know, I hope you can hear it in my voice. I am very passionate about this. I'm no longer a public servant. I came here to Nairobi this morning on Christmas week because I really believe in this. I think this is really important for the world we live in, for this complex, amazing world we live in, but for the possibility of the future, because the immigrants see the future ahead of everybody else. So we need to be around them, we need to embrace them, we need to tell them they're still part of us. We need to know that without them we can't define ourselves. Only through them can we come to ourselves. And we will be with you from Ireland all the way. And I know Ambassador O'Neill and Jane are really passionate about this as well. And our commitment is to do that. And later on you have a treat when you hear Kingsley Aikens, who is a a brilliant protagonist of all of this, and the insights he'll be bringing. So thank you again for inviting me. Thank you for this occasion. I hope the ambassadors enjoy their holiday and at home and rest as well, but you're doing really, really good and important work. Thank you very, very much indeed.